If you've ever made a website, or really if you've even been to a website, you know that it's pretty common for a website to have common design elements to it. You don't usually go to a website and every page looks totally different. That would be pretty disorienting, actually. Just about every website has common navigational elements, common logos, even HTML that you're going to see from page to page. Well, the MVC framework also provides us a mechanism to do this, to make our layouts a little bit more simplified. This mechanism is called shared layouts, and if you've ever used master pages or server-side includes from web forms or classic ASP, shared layouts work in a very similar way. They allow us to provide a common layout for all views. So everything that's common to all pages you can put in the shared layout, and then your views can just say, yes, here's the shared layout that I'm using, and you don't have to repeat that HTML and that razor code in every single view. The shared layout is going to use a method called renderBody. So what happens is when you access a view and that view uses a shared layout, your controller is going to pull up all the HTML and code from the shared layout, and wherever that renderBody method is, it's going to inject the code from the view, and that's the way you end up with one HTML document that gets returned to the client. Now, if you've got a shared layout sitting over on one side and you've got your view on the other side, how do you link them together? Well, you can either link them to a view at the view level by each view saying, yes, this is the shared layout I want and giving the path to that, or the MVC framework also gives us a mechanism called viewStart, which starts up with every view, and I can define a shared layout at that point. Let's take a look at how shared layouts get set up. Now, when you create an MVC project and you create the default internet project, it actually gives you some shared layouts to work with by default. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, yes, you're going to want to customize it drastically for your own website, but it is kind of nice to have this mechanism set up. What you want to look for is the shared folder, and in this case, the shared layout is called _layout.cshtml. Now, I want to point out that you do not have to start your names with an underscore. This is just a convention for shared layouts, just so people know this is a layout that's going to be used over and over. When I open up this layout, you'll notice it has all of the basic HTML stuff. The doc type declaration, okay, so this is HTML5. All your normal tags, some meta information here, links to an icon, various things that you would want to appear on every single page. And here it's got in the body some HTML that it wants to appear on every single page, some razor code that it wants to appear on every single page. And as we scroll down further, we finally find that renderBody method. So any view that's using this shared layout, when the controller looks for that view to return, it's going to take this code and this layout, and then it's going to take the code from that specific view and it's going to smush it in right here. And that's how we're going to end up with one web document. And this is very handy because if I want to change the look of my website consistently across all pages, I can just change this shared layout. I don't have to do like in the days when everything was its own unique HTML page and change every single HTML page. So we've got a footer, we've got all kinds of things. Now, the way this is linked to the views is actually in this file here called viewStart. And you'll notice here in this viewStart file, and this is where you want to have it by convention. You want to have it in the views folder, not in a subfolder, and you want it to be called _viewStart. And it just says, here's the layout that I'm going to be using. And so what happens is for every single view by default that does not override this statement, it will automatically use layout.cshtml for its view. Now you can override this on an individual view. All you have to do is take this exact same line, go to your view, and put some different layout in here. And that's how you can specify your layouts at a view level too. which is not something you'd want to do for your common views, but every so often you might have a view or two that you do want to have a distinct look, and that can be a real easy way to override your global settings. Sometimes when you're using a shared layout, you want a certain area to appear on every single page, but you might want the content of that area to be different from page to page. Some common places are up in the head. You might want to have different meta tags with various keywords and descriptions. Or you might want to have a sidebar on every single page, but the content of that sidebar you want to be different from page to page. Or maybe you just want to have a default section that has default code in it, but maybe on 1 or 2 pages you want to override the default code that's in that layout. Sections are dynamic areas that are defined in a shared layout. So in your shared layout, you get to delineate sections, and each view must put content there by default. Now, there are ways around this, but by default, if you've got a section in a shared layout, then any view that uses that layout needs to put content there. You will actually get an error from the MVC framework if your view doesn't put any content in that section. The render section method is what gets used to actually render the code that's in your view. So in your shared layout, you're going to see a render section method, and that will render whatever your view has defined to go in that section. You can make that section optional or overridden in the shared layout with a method called isSectionDefined. And you can check this to see if the view has defined a section. And if it has, you can use the views code, and if the view doesn't have it, then you can replace it with default code. So here I am looking at our default shared layout, and you'll notice as I get down here to this division, right above the section that has the render body method, I've got this render section method. The section name is featured, and here we've set required to false. So that means if a view doesn't have this section, we won't get any errors. I could replace this with true, and that would mandate that every view put some content there in this section. So whenever I serve a view up, and that view uses this layout, when it gets to this point in the HTML, it's going to look in that view for a section called featured, and if that section is there, it's going to drop that code right here. If I look at our index view, our default index view, you'll notice that it did just that. Here we've got the code section featured, okay, same name we specified here, and then here's the HTML that goes in that section, okay, and there's even a little bit of razor code in here. So when I fire this up and I get the index view, okay, I get all this code that gets rendered in that section. And here it is. And so that's how you can define dynamic areas in your shared layout where individual views can provide their own content. Sometimes you'll have snippets of a view that you want to appear in multiple places. A very common example of this is a login form. You may have an area of your site that's members only, and you may have an area of your site that's information that's available to the public. And on all those pages that are available to the public, you want to have an opportunity to log in. So you want to have a login form, but you don't necessarily want to put that on every single view that uses it because that same HTML might appear 5, 6, 7 times. And that's just difficult to maintain, especially if you make any changes to it. Partial views are a solution to this problem. They are pieces of views that you can then reuse. It's important to note that when you use a partial view, that anything it needs from the model you still have to account for. There's not really a good way to have a partial view and a model that sort of follows it around. So if I use a partial view in a regular view, I want to make sure the model that's bound to that view is going to have everything the partial view needs as well. And that's an area that some people overlook when they first start getting into partial views. So just make sure, when you bind that partial view, that the view model you're using has everything that partial view needs as well. The method that's used to render a partial view is, wittily enough, render partial. And you find this not in your shared layout, but you find this in the actual view. So you'll have views that may use one or more partial views, and you'll find this render partial method there. Another interesting use of partial views is they can be used for dynamic AJAX updates. So for instance, if your view uses JavaScript to make an AJAX call and it gets some data back, it can actually bind that data to a partial view and then render that partial view at that time along with the AJAX response. So partial views can be very useful for that as well. You might almost think of them as little snippets of front ends for AJAX responses. But by far and away, the most common use for them is to have pieces of HTML and code that you can reuse from view to view. I'm looking here at a slightly more complex view, an account management view. And you'll notice here in the accounts folder, we have all these different views, and we have some partial views here as well. And there's an underscore in front of them. Once again, it's mostly by convention to help you identify them. It's not necessary in order to make it work, nor is it necessary to name them partial at the end. But I do have some of these partial views that are going to recur throughout account management and maybe even a few different places as well. For example, here's the change password form. And as you can see, it's just a little snippet of a view, and it's a little form, the old password, new password, confirm password, and the change password value here. And so this is a view that I can then reuse in other views. So for example, in the manage page, if you come down here, you can see if the view bag has local password, then render partial, change password partial, and it will just render that view that's in there. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that here's another syntax you can use to render partial views, especially useful if it's just an inline snippet sitting off somewhere, and that's HTML partial. And it does almost exactly the same thing. You'll usually, when you see this, it's little one-off snippets sprinkled throughout views, and you tend to find this more in conjunction with the use of more elaborate code or other helpers. But they both do pretty much the same thing, and all they do is they find the partial view and then they render it in this section. So this is how you can write little bits of code as a partial view and then reuse those same views in the context of larger ones.